Now, could you help us a little bit understand what's meant by the Medicare Trust Fund? Is there a Medicare? Is there a safe in the wall somewhere that's the Medicare Trust Fund?
No. No.
Darn.
In fact, there are two trust funds, and they're accounting devices. There's no real money anywhere sitting aside, just like there isn't real money set aside for Social Security. But it's an accounting device, so it has some use to it, though, but in the sense that when revenue comes in that's associated with Medicare, it's assigned to the trust fund, and when spending goes out, it's assigned to the trust fund. And in the political sense, you're supposed to make sure the trust fund over the long term is always solvent, so that that imposes a certain amount of spending and tax discipline on the system. You got to raise enough money to cover the spending. Now, in the sense of what they did in Obamacare, they've essentially, the real truth of the matter is they spent the same money twice. Here's what they did. They cut Medicare by $700 billion, and that replenished the two Medicare trust funds. It put more money in the Medicare trust funds by reducing the rate of spending that was coming out of them. At the same time, they took that savings, counted it under what they call the pay-as-you-go scorecard, and used it to legislatively create a separate entitlement outside the trust fund. So you've got new spending outside the trust fund of $700 billion, and you've replenished the Medicare trust fund by $700 billion. That replenishment of Medicare will be spent at a later point in time, beyond the next decade, in 2015 or 2020. That $700 billion will go out in Medicare claims.
Now,
so the real crime of Obamacare, the real bottom line crime is they spent the same money twice.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to add to the deficit. That didn't save Medicare in any real sense, because there's going to be huge budget pressure that's going to force budget cuts at a later point in time.
Now, we should point out that Paul Ryan's proposal and Mitt Romney's proposals are just that. They're proposals, but Obamacare is the law, and this is going to happen. And do you believe, given your knowledge of Congress, that when these cuts to Medicare providers that are included in Obamacare, when they actually take place, and there's lots and lots of screaming, there are probably reductions in services to Medicare recipients, do you believe that Congress is going to sit by and let all that happen, or maybe take some action?
Well, the history is that if it starts to really pinch to the point where there are access problems, then Congress will come in and undo them. You have to understand that the cuts in Obamacare are likely to push the Medicare payment rate structure to such a low level that it'll fall below what's now paid out through the Medicaid program. Medicaid is a program for low-income Americans around the country, and it notoriously has a very constrained network of willing suppliers of services, because people look at the rates and say, look, I don't want to take those patients because I'm going to lose money every time I do. And Medicare is fast becoming like Medicaid in that regard because of Obamacare's cuts. And that'll become, it's one thing to maybe pay extremely low rates for, a certain segment of the population that doesn't have as much political power, which is really a tragedy, frankly, in my view. I think it's a terrible thing that that's the case. But to try to have it also happen in Medicare for seniors who vote in large numbers, I think is going to be, very, very difficult for Congress to handle.
All right, Jim, thanks very much for joining us. Appreciate everything you had to say this morning.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That's Jim Capretta of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and an expert on all things Obamacare, Medicare, and other cares.